We are in story 166, and we're looking at the healing of the crippled woman on the Sabbath day. And as we were just saying, that there are questions. Sometimes people say, "Why? And this woman, she's crippled. Well, why is she crippled? And one thing that we have to continue to remember is that we are living in a fallen world. So even to use a play on words, fallen. Well, let's just say you are fallen. You just fell off a tower and you're falling down. And as you're falling, you know that the minute you fall, you are heading towards the what? Towards the ground. Now, once you hit the ground, what's happening? You're done. So unless you get something to intervene in between your stepping or moving off the support of the tower and hitting the ground, your fate is death. Well, that's what's happening to mankind. Mankind has fell from the tower of spirituality. Man was a spiritual being and now has become natural, and the natural man is fallen like a rock. And God's saying to everybody, all you got to do is just believe in me, and you will no longer fall. You will be caught up. So the nature of man is fallen. And until we get the understanding that we don't have to continue to fall, all we got to do is believe in Jesus, and we can stop falling. But if we don't stop falling, then our outcome is death. And so in our falling state, we have all kinds of stuff going on, like infirmities, problems, sickness, blindness. All that stuff is happening. That's part of what that's part of the fall. And that's what makes us imperfect. And God says, I can change all of that. And so what we see here with this woman here is that here's somebody that is suffering from the problems of a fallen world. She has issues and problems. Jesus says that he's come to give us what? To give us life. So therefore he can intervene into our natural fall and give us spirituality, because in order to not fall, you have to awaken your what? Your spirit. And if you don't awaken your spirit, your natural man will continue to what? To fall. And so we're going to look at this a little bit, but I wanted to make sure that we understand this, and we're going to see a couple of things here about the nature of people. And sometimes the nature that you have has to be looked at and dealt with. All right, so let's go into this reading, and then we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. Let's take a look.
Story 166, Healing the Crippled Woman on the Sabbath. And he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And behold, there was a woman who had a spirit of infirmity for 18 years, and she was bent together, and was not able to straighten up at all. And seeing her, Jesus called her near and said to her, Woman, you have been loosed from your infirmity. And he laid his hand on her, and immediately she was set upright, and was glorifying God. And the ruler of the synagogue, much displeased that Jesus healed on the Sabbath, answered, saying to the crowd, There are 6 days in which it is necessary for us to be working. Come, be healed in these, and not on the Sabbath. But the Lord answered him and said, Hypocrite, does not each of you loose his ox or donkey from the stall on the Sabbath, and leading it away waters it? And behold, this one, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound 18 years, was it not necessary for her to be loosed from this bondage on the Sabbath? And he said these things, and all who were opposed to him were ashamed, and the entire crowd was rejoicing over all the glorious things that were being done by him.
All right. So what we see here is a situation where, once again, Jesus is in the religious gathering. He's there with the the teachers, and he's at the synagogue, and it says that he was teaching. It says, and he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. So he's there. He's giving forth instruction, and sometimes we'll read past that and just say, okay, he was teaching in the synagogue. But I think that's important, because what we see here is that Jesus was given instruction to people on a regular basis. He was doing it often. And so now we see another situation, and sometimes we could just read past that, but I think it's important to make sure that when we read that sentence, that we realize Jesus was given information. He was given truth. He was given the people an opportunity to hear what is real. And that's highly important, and I think is worth not just bypassing and going out. And he was doing it in a place where they should expect to get truth. When you go to a synagogue, or today you talk about people that are going to where? To a church. You expect to hear truth. And these are some of the few people that was fortunate enough when they went to that synagogue to not only hear truth, but heard it directly from who? From Jesus.
From Jesus.
Can you imagine that? And so you're there and Jesus is talking. And then not only is he talking, and then it goes on and says, and behold, there was a woman who had a spirit of infirmity. How long? 18 years. Boy, you don't give up, do you? Like you say, I've been praying for 18 years. I've been dealing with this for 18 years. I've been struggling for 18 years. And I'm sure she may have tried. Remember the other woman that had the issue of blood? You know, for it was 13 years or 12 years. And she tried all kinds of stuff, spent all her money. Who knows what this woman was trying to do, what she was, and just, you know, but yet somehow or another she had enough in her to get where Jesus was on this particular day. So sometimes there is a meeting of change. The Lord knows, because the Lord knew how long she was what? In her infirmity. And as we're going to see here in a minute, the Lord also knows who bound her. But the Lord also knew that as she traveled these years, he knew that there was going to be a time when they were going to meet. All right? Because whether she was born with it or she got it for 18 years, we don't know. But for 18 years she had it. And yet now here's that meeting. All right? Jesus is not, there's nothing that's surprising to God. God's not like, oh, I didn't know anything about this woman. Let me go. No, he knew there was going to be a time when I'm going to meet her and she is going to be loosed from her situation. And so I think that's important that we can take that with us, because like this woman, she had no idea how she's going to deal with this. What am I going to do? Sometimes you just get to the point where you just learn to do what? Accept it. This is just how it is. And I'm going to be like this, and there's no change. And sometimes we have things that are an infirmity to us. What's bounding us? What's crippling us? And sometimes we're trying to deal with it. And we can be like Paul. Well, Paul prayed and said, you know, Lord, but the Lord told Paul, my grace is sufficient for me. So Paul had to learn to what? Deal with his infirmity. This woman has a situation. She has an infirmity too. And now the Lord is saying, I'm going to loose you from your infirmity. And it says, and she was bent together and was not able to straighten up at all. So she's like, she's got some kind of structural problem with her body where she can't stand up straight, and maybe bent over and can't hardly walk well. And it says, and seeing her, Jesus called her near and said to her, woman, you have been loosed from your infirmity. Now, what was that? Just what? Words. But they were words said by who? Jesus. By Jesus. Sometimes we look at words and we don't think that they mean anything, but in reality, words are very important. Yes. When you're talking to individuals, words that are said, words that are not said are very important. All right? When you stand before the altar as a man and a woman, and you say to the other individual, when it says, do you take this man or you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded, and you do what? You don't do any spells or boom, 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 and get some magic dust. You just say what? Words. I do. You say some words. And those words become what? Binding. All right. When you enter into a new job, you have to sign documents. You say that you're going to do this, and they check out your background, and all the stuff is written down, and you give them a resume. What's on that paper? Words. But those words represent your what? Represent you. Right? And so, and we can go on and on about words. In the very beginning, God said, "Let there be light." But He said. He used what? Words. So the ability of God to be able to speak words and things happen is unique to Him. But because we are made in His what? In His image, He has allowed us to have, even in the natural realm, the understanding that words can do something for us. Now, I don't know of any other creature that's like that. Dogs we can use words to a dog, and a dog can understand it, but the dog don't give us words back. Animals don't have words to our understanding. All right. I mean, I'm sure they have ways of communicating, but I'm talking specifically about words, language of words. And so when Jesus said to this woman that you are loose from your infirmity, and He laid His hands on her, and immediately she was up. She sat upright. So it didn't take time. It wasn't one of those you go and wash and come back. It was immediately. All right. And so, here's another situation where, the Lord Jesus is doing something where it happens right then. Now, there were times that He told people to do what? Go and wash and different things, and so the Lord uses a variety of ways of dealing with people and their circumstances. So it's not how He did it. It's the fact that He did it, because He can use a variety of ways of doing it. So we don't want to get locked into saying something and then touching people. Some people try to look for formulas. They're trying to look for, and to me, I had to learn that, because I was trying to find the formula to how to do this right. And it's not a formula, it's a friendship. It's not knowing a formula, it's knowing God. Amen. And so if you know God, then God has what you need. Everything is in Him. And like we were talking earlier, it's not having faith of God, using God kind of faith. No, it's having faith in God. Because God is the one that does it. And so the Lord just spoke the words, laid her hands on her, and immediately she was upright and was glorifying God. And so now this woman is happy, and she's glorifying God, thanking God for what has just occurred in her life. And so you would think that everybody should be happy. But look what happens. Then the ruler, the who? The ruler. The head people, the folks that are running the religious institution, the folks that are running the church, the synagogue, all right, are upset. All right, the ruler of the synagogue was much displeased that Jesus healed on the Sabbath day. All right, so now he's going to get up and look what he says, because he's upset, and answered, saying to the crowd, who was just happy and all that, there are 6 days in which it is necessary for us to be working. Come to be healed in these, and not on the Sabbath. So his thing is, you are breaking our what? Our traditional rules. All right. So we're used to things happening this way, and this is our formula for how things work, and you are messing with our ingredients. All right. And so They think they already have it all what? Figured out. This is how it's done. You come on these days, you don't come on these days, and things happen and everybody be happy. Well, Jesus is about to show them how hypocritical they are. Because they don't see, they have no compassion for people. How people have real feelings and people have, the ability to have hurts. And they're looking at the system and they're not looking at the person. They're not validating this woman's issue. They're not giving it any credit whatsoever. They're looking at the fact that you just broke the system. But at the same time, but what about the broken woman? So it says, but the Lord answered him and said, first thing he did, he went right to the punch. He said, I'm not going to explain anything. I'm going to tell you exactly what you are. Hypocrite. So he called him a hypocrite. So Jesus didn't say, well, let me explain something to you first. He just turned to the guy and said, you're a hypocrite. Then after he called him a hypocrite, then he went to do what? To explain it. Hypocrite, does not each of you loose his ox or donkey from the stall on the Sabbath and lead it away and water it? All right. So he's like, you take an ox or a donkey that's tied up in the stall. You don't leave them all tied up on the Sabbath day. You don't say, well, it's the Sabbath day, I can't untie you. You got to stay there and be what? Be thirsty. But you go and you untie it and you allow it to move along freely so it can get to what? Get to the water. And behold, this one, being a daughter of Abraham, in other words, this is a human being from the line of the same line that you are from. In other words, this is somebody that's connected to you in a national sense. Whom Satan has bound 18 years. Satan has tied her up so she can't get to what she needs. The ox and the donkey need water. This woman needs to be able to be what? Loosed. Satan bound 18 years. Was it not necessary for her to be loosed from her bondage on the Sabbath? So he's drawing the analogy. He's helping these individuals to see that you have more compassion for an animal than you do for human beings. You'd be more worried about who's hurting here, versus considering it an ox or a donkey, versus whether this woman is hurt.
But when you break it all down, it comes down to finance because those are their crops and herds and stuff, and they make money off of it. So that's what they worried about, their money.
I got to take care that those ox and that donkey make me what? Make me money. And this woman, what can she do?
Nothing to me.
She's an embarrassment, or basically is how they look at it. All right? But then Jesus also points out that they are hypocrites, but he also points out an important thing, that how are we bound? We're bound by what? By sin. And who was the originator of this? Satan. Right? So he bound by Satan. By what? By Satan's deceptions. From the time he walked into the garden to deceive Eve and deceive Adam, and he's still doing what? Deceiving people to this day. And his deceptions bring forth crippling effects. Not only are we crippled sometimes in the body, but even more so we're crippled in the mind. But even worse than that, we're crippled in the what? In the spirit. So you see a lot of individuals that are crippled spirit. Now, this woman was crippled in body, but freed in her spirit. So even if her body never got healed, her spirit seemed to have been free, knowing the truth of Christ. These Pharisees, these religious leaders in the synagogue, these guys are grossly crippled in the spirit. If you could see them spiritually, they would be in more of a bound state than this woman was in the natural. Their spirit is tied up, is bound. And it's bound by Satan. By the same situation that bind this woman naturally is what's binding them, what? Spiritually. And yet they don't see it. but the thing is, you have to want to be bound, unbound. You have to want to be freed. All right, and they don't want to, and they didn't want her being unbound from her natural state. And then he goes on to say, and he said these things, and all who were opposed to him were what? Ashamed. He's able to point out the error of their ways. All right, and I look at that and I go, they weren't ashamed, or they were humiliated, or they were embarrassed, but did they repent? Did they change? Which is a big question. And the entire crowd was rejoicing over all the glorious things that were being done by him. All right, and so once again we see this crowd, and there were some there that were opposing him, and there were some there that were rejoicing. But the reality of it is that the nature of certain people is a nature that just is opposed to the things of Christ. And you wonder, why is that? What's going on? Why do we have individuals that no matter what Jesus did, they always seem to be what? In conflict with Christ. And you say, well, what is that? So I don't have the answer. I don't know what it is, but we're going to get a hint in just a bit, because we're going to look at these tares. And we're going to see if maybe this has something to do with it. So any other questions on 166? If not, we're going to move to 167, the tares. And maybe we'll get some enlightened understanding as to what's going on with some of these people anyway. Let's take a listen.
Story 167, the tares. He set another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a man sowing good seed in his field. And while men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares in the midst of the wheat, and went away. And when the herb sprang up and yielded fruit, then the tares also appeared. And the slaves of the homeowner, coming near, said to him, 'Lord, did you not sow good seed in your field? Why then does it have tares?' And he said to them, 'A man, an enemy, did this.' And the slave said to him, 'Then do you want us to go away and gather it up?' And he said, 'No, lest in gathering up the tares you uproot the wheat with them. Permit both to grow together until the harvest. And at the time of the harvest I will say to the reapers, gather up first the tares, and bind it in bundles to burn it, and gather up the wheat into my storehouse.'"
All right. So now this parable is the beginning of a series of a few parables. Now later on in story 171, we're going to get the interpretation of the tares. But he's going to give a few parables first, and this is a series of parables that we're going to look at. And I think it's important that we understand these, and we won't get to all of these parables today, but we are introduced to this. And I think it's good that we get this one right after dealing with this woman, and we're trying to see, well, why are these individuals so opposed to the Lord, and what's going on with some of these individuals. And we see this truth here that is brought out in this parable that to me is amazing, in the sense that what it's saying is that we may be dealing with individuals that God knows but we don't know, that are not of him at all. Now you say, well, how could you explain that? I cannot. I can't explain it. I don't know to any depth what that means. The Bible tells me that we should love and try to get everybody to know who Jesus is. But then my mind goes back to the book of Genesis, when God told Noah to build a what? An ark. And he did that because if you go back to Genesis 6, we see that there was a time when the scripture says that the the angels of God that left their first estate came down and saw the daughters of men and took them what? Why? And he said this happened then and also what? After that. So it happened, they're giving us a description of what happened then, but it's also saying it also happened again after that. That these fallen angels sold people into the what? Natural world. Well, during the antediluvian time, that's the time before the flood, when the angels came down and had these women, took wives, and they had children, and the Bible said they became mighty men, and that they were corrupt, and they were vicious, and they were mean, and it got to the point where God said that the entire earth was filled with what? With wickedness and with violence. And so the question then is, well, to what degree were these angels successful to manipulate and to tamper with the nature of the people that were on the earth during the antediluvian time? And then when you read what God said about Noah, it said that, it talked about how corrupt the world was. And then he said, but Noah was perfect in his what? Generations. So that means Noah's generation didn't have any line in which there was any corruption introduced into the anyone born. And oftentimes, and when we get into Genesis and we talk about this, I'm going to go into this a lot more elaborately, but just to give a just look at it, you begin to wonder, well, why didn't anybody come in? Why was it just Noah and his family? Was it to the point that all of them knew and they were just, I'm opposed. I'm not going to go in. I know. And did they know what was happening? And then there's conjecture out there that may make you think that when we see some of these massive building projects that we see all over the planet that were built, Baalbek and different other places that I won't try to get into now, and you say, well, when Noah was building the ark, were they maybe building something else, trying to preserve or save? Because remember, Satan is fallen. He's not ignorant. Satan knows. And so what did he do? So when you say, well, why are you bringing all this up? I'm bringing all this up because this parable is telling us that in this world, there are things that are sown into the world that God knows about that are not going to make it. They're tares. Mm-hmm. They're lost. Now, we know that the offspring born to the union of these fallen angels and these women were unredeemable. They are what? They're lost. And so when God destroyed that world, I think it is plausible to say that when he destroyed the world, that he was destroying mainly the introduction of those corrupt offspring. That's the majority of those that were lost. And the ones that weren't were actually saved. So is it possible? And once again, I'm just throwing this out there. I don't know. I wasn't there. But is it possible that it was just Noah and his family that had not been corrupted? So you look at that and they say, well, why would you even consider that? Maybe there were other people. Well, I think if there were other people, that maybe God wouldn't have destroyed the world. You say, well, where do you get that from? Well, I go back to Sodom and Gomorrah, where Abraham said, well, you're going to destroy this city. Suppose this, and he wiggled it all the way down. Suppose there's just 10 righteous people in there. He said, well, if there was 10 people in there, I wouldn't destroy it. Well, wait a minute. How many people were in the ark? 8. Less than 10. So you see the rationale that sees it. So is it possible that on that planet, God waited until there was only what? 8 people? In other words, less than 10? If there was 10 people, I would not what? Destroy. That's what he said about Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, how many people were in the ark? 12, 15, 50? No. Less than 10. Only 8. And then he destroyed it. And But he had to wait till certain people that were righteous died off. And so that's why Methuselah, when it says that when he dies, that's when the floods will come. And so once those individuals died off, and only left 8 left. So it makes you wonder, and I throw this out there. So now we look at these tares, and you say, well, what does this mean about tares? Well, could it just mean that even now, like how it said in Genesis, that these angels came down and they took wives, then, and also what? After them. All right? And I think it's important that we understand that. So when we look at this situation of these tares, it makes me think about Genesis 6. That this is still going on in a way that we may not totally understand or comprehend. But I think a lot of the stuff that we're seeing with this paranormal stuff and unidentified flying objects and all this other stuff, I wonder, I don't know how, but I wonder if somehow it's connected. And it's all part of it, or what these fallen angels, these extra dimensional beings are doing. I don't know it, I can't prove it, but I do what? Consider it. So if I throw that out there for just consideration. But as we look at this story, 167, the tares, it says, and he said another parable. And he's talking parables to give what? Clarity to those that have ears to hear. Before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven. So he's talking about how the things of God are, both natural and what? And spiritual. All right? The kingdom of heaven is like a man sowing good seed in his field. All right, so he's like a man that's sowing good seed in the field. All right, now, and we're going to cheat a little bit. And even though we're going to but we look at the story 171, and it tells us that when he gives the explanation of the field, that it says that the field is the what? Is the earth. The field is the world. Mm-hmm. All right? And so he's letting us know that that field represents the world. Mm-hmm. All right? So the good man sowed seed in the world. All right? And while men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares in the midst of the wheat and went away. All right? So if we cheat again and go back and look at the back of the book, and it says, and the enemy who sowed, actually let's go back up. It says, and the tares are the sons of the evil one. Oh. The sons of the who?
The evil one.
When we go back to Genesis 6, the children that were born to those women were children of who? The fallen angels. And so he says that these tares are the sons of the what? The evil one. All right? So he says that these tares, the enemy came and sowed tares in the midst of the wheat. Right in the midst of it. Mm-hmm. Children of the evil one, or children of the devil, and went his way. And when the herb sprang up and yielded fruit, then the tares also appeared. Mm-hmm. Right? So they grew what? Together. Mm-hmm. So now this makes me just stop and say, wait a minute, let me just take a moment here and scratch my head and rub my eyes and say to myself, is Jesus letting us know, just like it said in Genesis 6, that this thing happened then, but it also happened what? After that. Mm-hmm. All right? Let's read that. Hold on. Make sure we understand. Let's go to Genesis 6 real quick. And make sure we read that so we can have make sure that we have a good, clear comprehension. And so when we look at Genesis 6, and we read, just starting at the first verse, and we're going to go down. And it says, and it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, this is verse 2, that they were fair. All right? In other words, there was something beautiful about them. We'll talk about that a little bit later too. And they took them wives of all which they chose. And so it didn't say that they married them. It said they took. They took them.
Yeah.
Right? So we talk about, you hear people today talking about how the aliens are just taking folks, they abduct them. That could mean something, could be connected. Maybe it's not. I don't know. But I'll just throw that out there. And it said, and the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with men, for he is also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120. And it goes on in the fourth verse, and it says, there were giants in the earth in those days. All right, so that means that these were men of what? Great stature. Mm-hmm. And also after that. So giants in the earth when? On those days, and also after that. So is what Jesus talking about, is that the after that? Mm-hmm. The day that we're living in now. Mm-hmm. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. So that those two words after that are very important. Well, let's keep on. When the sons of God came in to the daughters of men. So it's saying it again as to what it produced. And they bare children. To them, the same became mighty men. Also, these are mighty men. Mm-hmm. All right, so mighty in stature, but also what? Mighty in what? Rulership. Who was confronting Jesus about the woman at the Sabbath, healing on the Sabbath day? The what? The ruler. One of the mighty men of the Sabbath. So is that connected? Could be. Which were of old men of renown. It says, and God saw their wickedness. The wickedness of men was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thought of his heart was only evil continuously. All right, and it says, the Lord repented that he had made it. All right, but then if you go and you look at
when he said he repented, he made that. Was he talking about man or the fallen angels?
Well, I think what we have to keep in mind here is that this is a word that it's an anthropomorphic word that's used where you're interpreting a state of what God is trying to say with using men's words. Now, for instance, remember when Paul said that I went up to the third heaven and I saw things that it would be illegal for me to what? To say. Which is why even when in Revelation, when the seven thunders uttered, they said, don't write down what the seven thunders said, just leave them there. Because if you try to convey it, you'll bring confusion. I think this is one of those things that is near that. When God tries to explain how he, and I'll use the word, feels, his emotions, he can't stuff into us what he's feeling. So he'll take the best word, and that is what? Feeling like, I wish it wasn't like this. But that can't be for God, because God knows everything. So that's why I say it's an anthropomorphic word. It's a word that helps us understand us in relationship to God in a small way. Because God cannot look at something and go, wow, I made a mistake. Because if he does that, he's not God. If he says, I wish I hadn't done it, wait a minute, that can't be true. Because God doesn't what? Doesn't make mistakes. So he can't be saying, I made a mistake here. He can't be repenting that this is not what or I wish I hadn't have done this. So when you read the word, you always got to make sure that you understand the nature of God first. Because keeping in mind that he's trying to get us to understand how God's feeling, guess what? But what you do feel from the word, when you wish you hadn't done something, you feel what? Sorrow. It's like, I could have done this better. That's how we feel. But we know that God can't feel that way. So then when he says he's repented, what is it actually saying? And I actually cannot describe that. I do know that it shows the fact that God can have sorrow. but yet understands that this must be. And we can get into a whole discussion about that, because it's like, it's the same thing when God made Adam and Eve, but then he let Satan, into the garden.
Also when he let Jesus die on the cross.
When he let Jesus die on the cross. So those feelings, but when you talk about repentance, God is not like, I wish I hadn't done this. You can't, because if you try to attach that meaning to it, then that means that ain't God. So you have to know God. That's why the most important thing is to know him. Then when people try to attach things to him, because once again, these words can be twisted. And yes, it can be confusion, and it can mean...
Because all the wickedness of man.
Well, he is sad about that, but he is disappointed that this is going on, but he's not surprised.
No.
And he's not caught off guard.
No.
So when I read that, I often think of, I can't grasp the fullness of that word. It's like if somebody was to say, what do you think about your children? Well, they're fun. Well, that's true, but it's a lot more to that, isn't it? To when you think about your children. So it's like, well, can you find a better word? Well, yes, we can find better words, but usually it's more than one word. So when they use one word to describe how God feels about this world, this planet, and the evilness, we know that even like you can't use one word for me to describe my children. The one word is just a glimpse into the feeling of God, which we cannot really paint properly. So you take. If I was to say describe your children or describe your marriage or whatever in one word, you'd be like, wow. I mean, I could pick one word and I can give you a hint, but you would never really get the fullness as to what. So I think that's where that comes in. But my point for going into this, and if we continue to just bring it out, remember, we're talking about these tares, right? Mm-hmm. And you look at verse 9, and it says, and these are the generations of Noah. It says Noah was a just man, so that means he was just, he was good, and perfect in his what? Generations. And Noah walked with God. So Noah, his situation of being perfect had nothing to do with his behavior. His behavior was the description of him being a just man. Perfect in his generations means he wasn't affected by what we had just read. That he wasn't affected by any of this tampering with his genetics, with his DNA. So I brought all of that in to look at these tares today, going on now. Do we have folks like that? And are they mighty men today, like how they were back then? And you go, well, we don't have giants today. Well, maybe not giants in physical stature. But what about some of the people that actually, that so-called 1% that rule the world? I don't know. I throw that out there as consideration that it should not be dismissed or ignored. But at the same time, I can't say, well, definitively, this is what it is. It could be something totally different. But I do think it's something to make sure that we are cognizant of and that we can think on and ponder. All right? But then he goes on, as these herbs sprang up and yielded fruit. All right? So they sprung up and yield what? Fruit. Then the tares also appeared. Didn't say anything about the tares yielding what? Fruit. They just appeared. And the slaves of the homeowners, and we talked about that, and when we look at the description in story 171, it talks about the servants are the what? The angels. And they come near and say to him, Lord, did not you sow good seed in the field? Why then does it have tares? So you sow good things. You sow men in the world. Why does it have devils? And he said to them, a man, a enemy did this. Who did this? The enemy. And the enemy he described as who? Is Satan. And the slaves said to him, do you want us to go away and gather it up? And he said, no, lest in gathering up the tares, you uproot the wheat with them. So what they're saying is that they have got to the point where the tares and the wheat do what? They look alike.
They look
and
very
they're
much
entangled.
alike. If you're a farmer, you go down there, you can't tell the difference. You have to really know.
And so there's a entanglement, and there is a familiarity, and there is a similitude about the tares and the wheat that are here with us.
And that's also a sign of God's love. He didn't say just go yank them up. He's like, well, I could try to save them, you know. He's still showing compassion and love, and just wait a minute, let's, ease up a little bit. So he had to slow them down a little bit.
Well, what this also points out is that he is not going to let one single blade of wheat get pulled up accidentally. In other words, he's not going to lose any.
No.
None that you've given me will I have lost. Now, then I go back to looking at when Jesus was choosing his disciples. Did he on purpose? I'm going to choose some wheat, but I'm also going to choose a tare. I'm going to invite the enemy into everything that I got to say and all that I do. Now, there were times, though, when Jesus was doing something and he couldn't bring all his disciples.
No.
He said, y'all stay here, and I'm going to bring Peter, James, and John. He did that quite often. So there were certain times when y'all can't come. Only these three. All right. So there were times when Judas was not allowed to go and do what, and he didn't specifically point out Judas at that particular time because he left other people too that we know were good people. Because Matthew was one that followed Jesus, Levi, and he didn't bring Levi to those meetings, but at the same time we know Matthew, right? Because he also told Levi, "You're going to help write my story," though, because he was a tax collector, so he knew how to write very well. So he wrote one of the Gospels, but he would leave Judas out. And so by looking at this, and once again, this is me trying to use the scripture that is given to come to a conclusion that I cannot prove, but I can say, think about it. So was Judas one of those tares? And which is why he said that I have lost none except the son of perdition. In other words, that was what he was. He was never going to accept. Judas was always in that mind. And once again, I don't know this, but it makes me consider it. But the one that does know it is Jesus.
Amen.
God knows.
Amen.
All right. So he says, don't pull them up unless you pull up the wheat with them. And then he goes, permit both to grow together until the harvest. And at the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, go up first, gather up first the tares, and bind it in the bundles, and what? And burn it. And gather up the wheat into my what? Storehouse. So we see that there will be a separation of the wheat and the tares, just like there was a separation of Noah from those people that only had wicked imaginations continuously in their heart. Right? God didn't destroy, would not have destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, we know, if there were just 10 righteous people. Right? But during Noah's time, he couldn't find 10 righteous people. So the world was what? Destroyed. Sodom and Gomorrah, they couldn't find 10 righteous people. There was only 4 people that left. Lot, his 2 daughters, and his wife. And the wife didn't have a successful exit either.
She didn't really leave. She wanted to stay.
She wanted to stay.
She got twined up with them.
Because she wouldn't have been looked back. And he told her, don't look back now. Keep going.
So what this shows us is that there is probably a whole lot more to evil than what we really understand. I can't explain it, but one thing I do know, and I'm happy for this, God knows.
Amen.
God knows what and where evil really is.
He knows what's in the dog.
Right. So when we see things going on, we go, why are people doing this? Why do people, and so we talk about, we see all this different things that are happening during this new administration. We see racism coming up and everything. And I always try to make sure we keep this in mind. I said, now listen, I said, we're living in a sinful world, and you're going to always have hate. Mm-hmm. It's always going to be in this world. And I said, and it don't have to be hate between skin color, because remember back in the day when the Irish were fighting each other, brothers and sisters, white. Why? Because one was Catholic, the other was what? Protestant. And they were killing each other. All right. So I mean, you have that in the Muslim worlds, where you have different Muslim groups that fight each other. Mm-hmm. Some of them could be same, but you pick one religious philosophy over another. This killing and hate has always been, and it's going to continue to be, because we're living in a world that is controlled by the prince and the power of the air. Yeah. Satan is the god of this world. And there is evil here, and there are, based on this description and this parable, which we will revisit when we get to story 171, we'll even talk on some more, there has been planted here. Planted by who? By the devil. So the devil has seeds planted here. He does. Who and what are they? I can't tell. I can't uproot them now. Why can't we uproot them now? Because Jesus said not to.
Not to.
He said, let them what? Let them grow together. So that's why we need prayer, to continue to allow the Lord to lead and guide us, so that we are led by the Spirit and not by sight. All right. So we're going to stop there. Any other comments or questions? We thank God for that lesson.